Hello, and welcome to Theorizing with a Hammer with Derick Varn. And today we're going to talk about conceptual nominalism. Now, what is conceptual nominalism? In a short phrase, it is not confusing the words used in any given language that may be homonyms with other words that don't actually represent the same thing. You need to be nominalistic about the concepts. Abstractions do not exist as Platonic forms unless you have a metaphysics which makes them exist as Platonic forms. So basically, you're a Platonist and you believe that all ideas exist in the mind of God, or space aliens, or the simulation, or whatever. Or you think that concepts emerge somewhat organically from their use in a given language. Now, why is this important? It doesn't seem important immediately. I mean, think about it. How many times have you used a term that doesn't seem like it really matters when you talk to someone else? You both have a rough notion of what it means, right? Freedom, liberty. We talk about these reified abstractions. Now, reification in formal logic means something different than reification in critical theory if your critical theory is informed by Hegel or Marx. So we're going to come back to that term. But reification here just means an abstraction from which you can set a bunch of ideas. It is not something that exists in the world. It is reified, made into a thing. Well, conceptual nominalism is just a little bit of acid that melts away the thingness of these concepts. What do we mean when we talk about freedom? What do we mean when we talk about equality? All right. I can play a game where we talk about true equality and somebody else can talk about true equality, and they might be talking about a mathematical principle where I'm talking about relative social equity, and they're not the same thing. One of the biggest examples of this when you deal with critical theory is class, all right? So when you're talking about social class, you're usually talking about some more or less liberal definition of social class, which uses income brackets divided up pretty much along Kurzweil lines, along a bell curve generally. But when a Marxist talks about class, they're not talking about your income per se. And in fact, in the critique of the Goethe program, Marx almost says worrying about equal distributions is a waste of time. There's no way for it to be equal and fair. One concept cuts against the other. And instead you look at your autonomy in relations to production. So do you draw a wage, or do you produce a commodity from which someone else profits, right? Then you are working class. Now, one of the problems, though, with a lot of our conceptions of class is we're not consistent with our categories, all right? And again, this conceptual nominalism helps, even in Marxism. So Marx talks about the lumpen proletariat. Marx gives you no functional definition of the lumpen proletariat. In fact, given the Hegelian methodology that Marx operates on, Marx doesn't give you functional definitions of most of the categories. But the categories for capitalist and worker are clear because they are delineated by example in Das Kapital and in other texts, actually. You can clearly find them. What is your relationship to the general wage fund? When you're talking about class as opposed to social status class, cultural capital, any of those things, they might overlap or intersect with Marxist class, but they're not the same thing. Exactly. So you can have cultural capital class distinctions from the Berderian perspective, high, middle, lower class culture, within a range of people within the same Marxist class system, because they're not the same classifications. And if you think about what class is short for, what is class short for? Classification in the mode of production. And what does class explain? A kind of relationship. So different definitions of class explain different relationships, and you have to be very careful in delineating them. And one of the most frustrating things even good Marxist academics, good liberal academics, critical theorists will do is oscillate and equivocate between those definitions without even realizing they're doing it. I was reading Christopher Lasch the other day, and he was talking about the working class in the 20th century, but also talking about the working class in America in 1820s that contributed to Mormonism. Well, the working class that contributed to Mormonism, some of them were wage laborers, but most of them, given the development of the U.S. economy, were tenant farmers or sharecroppers, and probably tenant farmers giving their region. Now, a tenant farmer is an exploited class, but doesn't really have a wage relationship in the same way. They're essentially forced to rent land. They have control over the crops they produce. They have to pay their rents either from profits from their crops or from percentages of their crops, or from or in kind. And sharecroppers, they don't have control over the crops they produce. They are usually involved in these large monocropping operations when they existed, and they also have to give most of their crop as rent, for whatever. They also have to pay currency, they pay taxes and stuff like that. But so that's the situation they're in. Technically speaking, in Marxist working class, those people aren't working class. We also think about like our cultural definitions of working class. And we think about working class in relationship to blue collar or white collar labor. And we've gotten away from calling things white collar because that's, an early 20th century habit about, rules of dressing that we don't really have anymore. And sometimes you hear people say professional class, managerial class, or they'll crunch them together as PMC. Now, while I actually do think that these theorists who are talking about the professional managerial class are onto something about different interests within different groups, it is unclear that they are a separate classification by any of the strata that you meet, except for maybe income, and not even always that. Furthermore, blue-collar laborers are often people who own their own business, plumbers, electricians, are gilded out, as private contractors and make sometimes now higher wages than, or not even higher wages, higher incomes. Okay, because some of them aren't, most of them in some ways are not. Most of certain of those groups are not wage earning. They're contractors. And to even make it more confusing in a legal sense, there are people who are legally contractors but are effectively earning a wage. You can see how this gets down real fast. So you need conceptual nominalism to melt those categories down and see what the definitions really are, and then see if you're actually talking about the same thing. And if you're not, you need to be more rigorous in your explanations. And so in a conceptual matrix like class, that's one thing, all right? What about other ideas? We use ethnicity and race interchangeably in English, although we have a clearer idea of ethnicity than race. But we'll refer to things like Latino as a race, even though Latino is, not even one, it's two linguistic categories. It kind of describes the people from a certain part of the world. We might change that to Latinx or Latin, which is what I like to use, because, again, we're trying to deal with certain categorical frameworks, but then we try to smush them into our categorical frameworks of race. Furthermore, when you actually look at definitions of race from around the world, they don't often conceptually match. And oh my God, if you look at the genetics of human differences, they really don't map onto any culture's concept of race or ethnicity. Our concepts of race and ethnicity change, but we use them interchangeably. And in fact, we often don't understand the past because we use them interchangeably. All right? Because we use them in ways and read them back onto time periods where, yes, there was in-group, out-group selection, but no, that in-group, out-group selection didn't look anything like what we use now. So again, you need conceptual nominalism. What are the relevant traits that are actually being adjudicated, not just at one time, but over time periods overall? Skin color traits are often not even recorded for certain time periods. So you can't always have the concepts you use now to understand the past. And also you can't always use the concepts that you use now that have the same name as the concept that somebody else has used right now to understand that you're talking about the same thing, because you often aren't. People will say there is no middle class. Well, what does that mean? you're actually arguing with a completely different conceptual framework. You're not actually saying anything as meaningful as you think. All right. And so conceptual nominalism is an acid that can get you out of a lot of problems. And that is another way we theorize with a hammer. Over and out. Check me out here at Zero Books on Pop the Left and here at Theorizing with a Hammer. And you can also check me out on the Emancipation Network, where I host another podcast called Mortal Science. I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.